in terms of implementation. We are working with 300 million or so euros of funding, and we are looking at 16 countries. So we need to be able to sort of distill priorities at the country level to be able to really support, those top line priorities. And which is why, this country level conversation that we are having, the distillation of priorities is absolutely important.
This is Financial Inclusion Unlocked, an SIJ production. Welcome to the Financial Inclusion Unlocked show hosted by me, Jack Farron. This is the podcast meeting sector leaders and innovators across the globe to discuss how we can unlock the potential of financial inclusion as an enabler for the SDGs. This is a podcast that is produced by SIJ Media, and our first series is supported by the Swiss Capacity Building Facility. When climate disasters strike, the world's most vulnerable communities often face devastating financial losses. In an era of increasing climate risks, traditional disaster response isn't enough. Communities need financial solutions that put them in control of their recovery. In this episode, I met with Nilesh Prakhash, co-director of the Global Shield Against Climate Risks, as we explored how locally led climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions, or CDRFI, are increasing resilience. Nilesh has over 20 years of experience working on development and climate change issues within the public sector, regional and international space. The Global Shield Against Climate Risks is a joint G7 V20 initiative to strengthen the financial protection and resilience of vulnerable countries and people. We discussed the Global Shield's in-country processes and the support that it offers from initiation to implementation of support packages. For example, you will hear how Ghana purchased its first drought insurance policy in 2024, which secured a payout of $960,202 to combat recent drought in early 2025. Enjoy. Nilesh, thanks so much for joining me on the show. Really looking forward to our discussion today about CDRFI and the Global Shield.
Good morning, Jack. Thanks for having me in this episode of the Financial Inclusion Unlocked podcast.
Great. So before we dive into the Global Shield, I'd just like to kind of reflect on your journey over the past decade, working in the climate change, climate action and climate finance space. I know you were with the government of Fiji, then with UNDP, GIZ, so many fantastic organizations, and now with the Global Shield. So, if I take you back over the past decade, what have you seen and achieved in this space?
I'm an economist by training, and for the large part of my 20 plus years of professional experience, I've dealt with national and sectorial policy, national budgets, national development programs, and finance. And within this public sector role, I've also done some very interesting work, in climate change, specifically on mitigation and adaptation policies. But I've really been very interested and instrumental in the climate finance space as well. For example, on the issuance of the first ever sovereign green bonds in Fiji, proceeds of which, were directed towards mitigation and adaptation projects. I've also led the creation of a national climate fund and its capitalization. And today it is actually recognized as a very useful instrument, financial instrument for addressing slow onset risks in Fiji. And this is primarily to do with the relocation of communities and critical infrastructure in Fiji. In fact, very lately, I heard the current Minister for Finance, in Fiji talk about the replenishment of this climate fund. So from the national space, I pivoted towards a regional climate agenda, and that's with GIZ, the German Development Corporation, and then further into the international climate change space with the Secretariat of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its finance ministers, which is collectively referred to as the CVF V20. And this is where, in fact, I joined the Global Shield family. In fact, I was at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP in 2022, where the Global Shield was commissioned, and I formally assumed the role of the co-director for Global Shield Secretariat mid of last year.
Thanks, Nilesh. And when we look at the work of the Global Shield and we see the term CDRFI, in simple terms, What does that actually mean?
CDRFI actually, I mean, it's a loaded abbreviation there, which stands for Climate and Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance. So it simply refers to a set of financial instruments and mechanisms that really aim to increase the resilience and provide protection against financial impacts of climate and disaster risks. But Jack, I want to make a distinction here between the nature of CDRFI. Aspect there is we are looking at ex ante financing, which means financing that occurs before disasters happen, and the other, of course, is ex post financing, which is financing that is made available post disasters, when disasters have struck. So they are very important sort of examples of ex ante financing. For example, we are looking at insurance policies, and within this domain parametric insurance has become quite popular. We are also looking at shock resilient loans. We are looking at contingency funds, or some say disaster risk funds. We are also looking at catastrophe bonds, where the proceeds will be used to respond to some of these disasters. And when it comes to, like, for example, ex post financing, we are looking at emergency loans, for example. And a lot number of times what we have seen is that a lot of bilateral donors, for example, in climate vulnerable countries, they step up with international aid. So there is that aid sort of programming thing which happens post disaster. And of course in countries where massive infrastructure loss has happened, and we've seen this in the Caribbean region, in the Pacific region, where massive infrastructure loss has been done, there's a lot of mobilization of reconstruction grants. So I think this is an important distinction. We are looking at ex ante financing and ex post financing, but I guess for the work that we do in Global Shield, we are primarily focused on pre-arranged financing, and this is in fact an important part of the comprehensive approach to disaster risk management, because by having financial resources which is readily available, governments, businesses, individuals, they can respond more quickly and effectively to disasters, reducing the overall impact and facilitating faster recovery. And there's one more point that I want to mention here, and this is to do with climate risks. And I think we are all in the age of artificial intelligence, where modeling capabilities have advanced so much, and with these advancements, there's a lot of these climate risks can actually be modeled. They are modelable, and therefore we believe that pre-arranged financing must become a standard for addressing a lot of these climate risks.
Okay, Nilesh, you mentioned that the Global Shield story started in 2022 at the COP, and pre-arranged finance is also an integral part of what the Global Shield does. So for someone who's listening now and has not heard of the Global Shield against climate risk before, what exactly is it, and how does it work in practice?
So the Global Shield against climate risks was actually launched, as I previously alluded to, at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP in 2022, and it is a joint effort of the V20 finance ministers and the G7 country. And at that point, Germany was obviously leading the G7 presidency. So the initiative supports climate vulnerable countries in building financial resilience against climate risks and addressing loss and damage through pre-arranged climate and disaster risk financing and insurance solutions. So one might wonder why Global Shield. So as we all understand and know that we are in an era of unprecedented climate change. As IPCC points out, the scientific evidence points out, climate-induced events are becoming more frequent and the impacts are much more intense, and which means that loss and damage will be inevitable. In fact, if we look at, there are lots of numbers on loss and damage, in terms of what the loss and damage numbers looks like, but I like to refer to the numbers that have been published by the independent high-level expert group on climate finance, which estimates that annually climate vulnerable countries would need somewhere between $200 to $400 billion in loss and damage finance. And that is staggering, and we know that current flows of climate loss and damage finance is nowhere near, to what is actually to required. Therefore, the addressing loss and damage and helping, people and communities to bounce back quicker from climatic impacts becomes a critical third pillar of climate action. And this is what the Global Shield is aiming to do. And we do so by pre-arranging financial solutions that will provide rapid and reliable liquidity when climate impacts are seen in countries. And therefore, by providing these kind of sort of financial solutions, pre-arranged financing solutions, we hope to be able to lessen the impact of climate disasters, and of course boost the resilience of people and their livelihoods. And in terms of the overall journey, so since the commissioning of the initiative, the Global Shield is active in 16 countries across Asia, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean region. We've come a long way with respect to implementation on the ground. So in all the 16 countries, I would say we have rolled out the in-country processes, which really sits at the heart of Global Shield work. With at least one country that is in the African region, Ghana, we've had the full spectrum of work. We've seen the full spectrum of work in Ghana, which is doing the in-country work to coming up with a request for support and then proceeding on to securing a financial instrument. And in fact, by December of last year, the parametric insurance product, which Ghana had secured from ARC Limited, from the African risk pool, in fact, the triggers were met, and they will eventually be a payout. And I believe the paperwork and all this, is in train, and Ghana would be receiving a payout for the drought insurance product, which they secured from ARC Limited. So in saying that, I want to sort of close by saying that with all the sort of country work coming to sort of a maturity stage, where countries are able to sort of, having gone through all the in-country work, consultations, the stock take, the gap analysis, and all that, countries are now sort of in a stage to submit the request for support to the Global Shield. Of course, we have due processes, which will take place, once the RF is received by the Global Shield Secretariat, which means, we will go through a quality assurance, process. We will check this against solutions. We will also have, further consultations with countries. So all in all, I would say there's a lot of momentum in Global Shield's work. We are receiving a majority of the request for support this year, and then that means, we really need to shift into the implementation gear. So which means we need to be curating, financial solutions by working closely with our financing vehicles and then offering this to the Global Shield countries.
So Nilesh, just to dive a bit deeper now into the in-country process, which I know the objective of this is to identify country-specific needs in an inclusive process where all the stakeholders involved in the local market come together for that request for support for CDRFI instruments and solutions. So just kind of talk to me how this has taken place in those 16 markets and what those first steps look like.
Okay, Jack. So the in-country process, which really, as I said, sits at the heart of the Global Shield work. It's really a very transparent and a country-led and a socially inclusive model of work, which we are deploying, in countries. So we work with existing, country or regional structures, and we do have a lot of, political guidance. And in most cases, in our Global Shield countries, this political guidance is provided by finance ministries, which means they are the conveners on the ground, and they are able to sort of bring all agencies of government, and we then sort of benefit from whole of government discussions on climate risks. Each of the agencies, like for example, if you're an agriculture agency, if you're from an infrastructure department, we are then able to have a round table, a dialogue with all these agencies of government in terms of the climate risks and potential risks in the future, and on this basis, planning decisions, decision making, budget formulation, and finance mobilization discussions are taken. So this is, as I said, is a very consultative process. We do have a broad range of stakeholders, ministries, regulators, civil society organizations, private sector players. They're all engaged in the country conversations, in the country dialogues, and they help establish, first and foremost, what is happening. You discuss the state of play, but importantly, what they do is they are able to identify what are some of the financial protection gaps. And of course, if you're game enough to identify the gaps, then you should be game enough to identify what are some of the financial and technical needs to be able to sort of address those gaps. And our ICP, in fact, has it's a 6-step process. I'll briefly touch on. So we of course need to initiate the in-country process, so which means the dialogue, the political level dialogue that we need to have with governments. But importantly, within this stage, we need to establish an in-country coordination structure, which means because Global Shield Secretariat sits in Germany, we need an in-country support structure that will be our sort of, go-to person, go-to sort of, structure for all country level, conversations, which means if we need to organize workshops, if we need to undertake, specific consultations. So that's a first and foremost, step that we need to take once we get the political sort of green light from the countries. And then we move on to the stock take process, which is really taking stock of what's happening in the CDRFI space in the particular Global Shield country. And once we do that, then of course, we come up with a gap analysis. And then through this, stock take and the gap analysis and, rigorous, sort of stakeholder consultations, we then come up with a request for support to the Global Shield Secretariat. But in saying that, Jack, I think what's important here is that within this process, we also have a lot of input from, in our case, we have the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. And I think in certain countries, like for example, Bangladesh, we have a very credible institution, the Institute of Water Modeling, which is the national sort of coordination structure there. They provide a lot of analytics, support and input into the process. So which means a lot of these conversations that we're having at the country level, this is informed by risk modeling. And this is the importance of, so they sort of weigh in on the risk analytics side and they inform the conversation. So once the request for support is there with the Global Shield Secretariat, we of course go through a review process, which at the moment, we have a technical advisory group. So this is like really a consortium of experts, who look at what's been submitted at the country level and they check for robustness, they check for, usefulness and that sort of thing. And once this process is over, then we go through a tailoring of the support package. And this is where importantly, the three financing vehicles of the Global Shield, which is the Global Shield Solutions Platform, which is hosted at the Frankfurt School, and the Global Shield Financing Facility, which is hosted at the World Bank. And then, of course, we have the Joint Multi-Donor Fund of the CVFV20. They all sort of weigh in terms of what sort of support they can provide. So within this tailoring space, then we also have a bigger sort of ecosystem of players, which is comprised of the what we call the coordination hub. And coordination hub primarily consists of institutions and players who are present in the countries. And so they will also determine like what if any of the requests which are featuring in the country's request for support, if they can pick up on these requests and they can sort of support it through their ongoing program. So that's again a very useful step that we take, because we don't want to sort of reinvent the wheel, but we want to sort of promote what each of the actors are doing. And if they are able to do so with their existing programs and funding, then so be it. So that's another useful process which we have as part of the in-country process. And then of course once the solutions have been identified and the financing has been identified, then we move on to the implementation of the support package. One point that I want to sort of mention here, Jack, is that even though countries may submit very large requests, like for example in millions, 200, 300 million as examples, but the point is we are working with very limited funding in terms of implementation. We are working with 300 million or so euros of funding, and we are looking at 16 countries. So we need to be able to sort of distill priorities at the country level to be able to really support those top line priorities. And which is why this country level conversation that we are having, the distillation of priorities is absolutely important, because we have on one hand, we have limited resources. We need to be able to, in close collaboration with the country and the stakeholders that operate in the country, we need to be able to establish what are the priorities, and then we go and address those priorities, because at the end of the day, we can't address everything. And that's the reality, But I guess, from our side, we of course remain very open, to more funding, just so we can support more financial solutions in the countries. But of course, going forward, we hope to be able to, onboard more countries so that, we can provide Global Shield support to more countries beyond the 16 that we have right now.
The first series of the Financial Inclusion Unlocked podcast has been sponsored by the Swiss Capacity Building Facility, who fund transformative projects that advance financial inclusion. For example, in India, SCBF supported Ibiza in providing climate insurance to smallholder farmers across selected markets. The initiative focused on product design, farmer outreach, platform development and monitoring. Field visits helped to understand the needs of farmer producer organisations and smallholder farmers, leading to the creation of a parametric insurance product. It covered crops and vegetables against climate risks like drought, excessive rainfall, and disease. Continuous farmer and insurer feedback helped in refining the product to meet specific challenges. SCBF also supported financial literacy efforts to empower farmers to understand and trust the insurance scheme. The project insured nearly 55,000 smallholder farmers, 75% of whom were women. By enhancing resilience to climate risks and improving financial stability, SCBF helped empower rural farming communities and foster sustainable development. Back to the show. Let's look at an example of one of these in-country processes from start to finish. I know Ghana was the first country that submitted a request for support, and you briefly touched on the parametric insurance solution with ARC Limited a few moments ago. So how did this look in practice in terms of the request for support, but also now the local implementation with different stakeholders?
Jack, so obviously Ghana's example is a very good one here, and I think it is commendable the way the country sort of took on board this initiative and the record time at which they sort of delivered their request for support. Again, bearing in mind that they had to do all the sort of necessary steps, in terms of what is required under the in-country process of Global Shield. So I think the good part about Ghana is that we had a lot of political support from the Ministry of Finance, and so the national government's leading the charge and being in the driver's seat is really, I can say, is one of the strongest selling points of our implementation model. Because if you look at traditional programs where it's very much supply driven, where it's donor funds determine what sort of priorities are implemented. I think if we reflect on that and we see the Global Shield's implementation model, countries here determine the CDRFI priorities based on, again, a robust understanding of the climate risks. They also take stock of what is working and what is not working in their particular context, and then they take decisions with a full overview of the various partners. Because many a times what happens is that you would have many actors, many sort of development partners, development agencies, working in country settings, and they will have their own sort of unique offerings, so it's all in dribs and drabs. So what we need to be able to do, and what we are doing through the Global Shield, is we're bringing it all together. By nature, we are a coordination initiative, so we bring all these activities and sort of partners together in a room, just so we all understand what they're doing, and then countries then get a full picture of what is going on, and that is then sort of the sort of basis of determining like what are the critical next steps, what needs to be funded. And I guess this kind of political leadership is actually very, very important. And as I alluded to earlier, in most cases we have this political leadership from ministries of finance, and rightly so, because they are the executing arm in government, and they of course hold the purse strings. They have the mandate on overall public budgets and public finance. And we've seen, like, with the engagement of ministries of finance, and I've personally been part of some of the country conversations and country dialogues under the auspices of Ministry of Finance. This is all happening in a very engaging and a very inclusive bottom-up approach, which is a very useful way of informing what are the priorities that needs to be funded. So all in all, I can say that our implementation model is really shifting the paradigm in Global Shield countries. One, which is from the conversations that are focused on crisis management, which is often the case, to one that is really layered with risk information, and that is again sort of informing public finance utilization, international finance utilization, and that then sort of contributes to the overall sort of resilience building of these countries. Especially in the case of Ghana, this, as I said, this was done in a record time. The country was able to secure support from the financing vehicles of the Global Shield. And one of the things that really shifted was, the drought policy, which they secured from ARC Limited. So the northern part of the country, is affected by drought, and there was a drought policy which was offered by ARC Limited. So there was funding premium support from that, from KfW, facilitated by BMZ in a German ministry. So that insurance product was secured, and by end of last year, the triggers were established, and now the country is receiving a payout. So I think whilst Ghana is a model that this ICP process can really be done in a short span of time, 6 months or so, I think it is very, very contextual. There are some countries where there's information is scant. You have vast stakeholders. You need to do more sort of in-country conversation. You need to meet lots of stakeholders. So again, whilst 6 months is ideal, we do see that in some other jurisdictions this can obviously take time, and especially in the Pacific region, if I may, where the Global Shield is actually testing a regional approach. This has actually taken about a year now, and we are now at the stage of bringing everything together, the stock tape report, the gap analysis that was done, and now we are at a stage where we are actually writing the request for support, which would come from the Pacific, the 3 Pacific countries that are actually part of the Global Shield, cohort of countries at this stage. So again, this will differ by countries and by region.
For sure. I can only imagine, the secretariat that are based in Germany. It must be very tough, right, to kind of effectively coordinate between 16 countries and this huge ecosystem of actors that make up each market. How do you do it?
That's actually a very important question, and I think one of the unique selling points for Global Shield is that we are working with a very large ecosystem of players. And this, when I say large ecosystem, I'm primarily referring to development agencies, bilateral partners, civil society organizations, multilateral partners who are all sort of present on the ground and working and supporting Global Shield countries. And so one thing that we don't want to do, in the sort of Global Shield process is that we don't want to sort of step on the toes of other development agencies or what they're doing as part of their existing, mandates, as part of their existing programming efforts. What we want to be able to do is to be able to establish what they are doing, and if they can continue to do what they are doing, so long as it remains relevant, in the countries. So I think that is an important element of the work that we do in country, which is really bringing together all these, players, as part of the in-country, coordination, as part of the in-country stakeholders who inform, the state of play, what's working, what's not working, and then where potentially can there be further interventions. So I did mention that, we do have the coordination hub that comprises of 60 or so members, and members is there actually organizations like UN agencies, we have development partners, we have bilateral, programs that are featuring in countries. They're all part of the sort of ecosystem, which is called the coordination hub. So that is a very important, sort of a go-to platform for us, when it comes. In fact, I would say they are the sounding board there. And so that priorities which we are establishing through the coordination hub is actually very, very important. Importantly, I think as I said, because we operate with very limited funds in terms of what we can effectively deploy in countries, we need to be able to establish like what these partners can do based on their existing sort of portfolios in these countries. So again, it's a challenging task to bring everyone together, but I guess setting up that in-country structure is very important. And from the efforts of the Global Shield Secretariat, we are now having this we do have regular coordination hub meetings. We are now sort of doing that by regions. Just yesterday we had the Latin America and the Caribbean coordination hub meeting. So all those sort of actors working in the Latin American and the Caribbean region, they were in the sort of call to take stock of what's happening and really sort of bring to the fore the kind of solutions and which they are funding and the kind of work which they are doing. So as challenging as it may be, I think we do have some established processes for coordinating these actors, and I think it's very, very important for us to be able to do that. And I'll give you an example why this is so important, when we're talking about the ecosystem. The country of Pakistan, which is a Global Shield beneficiary country, in 2022, they had, a major disaster, and the damage, which they sustained was in billions. That's billions of dollars in damage. So obviously, that funding flow is not there to sort of support the country in its entirety. But what has happened out of the Global Shield process, in Pakistan, and again they had all the provincial provincial consultations, and that conversation which happened at the country level led to the distillation of priorities. And last year, at COP29, when Pakistan formally submitted their request for support, to the Global Shield. We saw that the request for support, if I can, use the number here, is around 200 million US dollars. So you can see the importance of this country level conversation and the importance of coordinating with all those actors, at the country level. We are able to distill from a big disaster and the damage that was sustained there to a package, which is much more workable, I would say, considering the limited resources we have. I think this is something which makes a lot of sense, and we can sort of work with this with our financing vehicles. And again, I'm not saying that we would be able to sort of meet all the requirements which is submitted as part of Pakistan's request for support, but I think it does present a very practical number which our financing vehicles can work with.
And Nilesh, looking at 2025, so we've discussed about Ghana and Pakistan, who are two countries that have submitted their request for support. You mentioned earlier in the show that you're expecting several more countries to follow suit. So what are you looking forward to for the rest of 2025 for the Global Shield?
This is a very important year for us. So we consider 2025 as an year of implementation for us. I think having gone through the first country and the full spectrum of work in Ghana, and late last year receiving the request for support from Pakistan, we do expect to receive a number of support packages from countries. Say we're looking at at some point we should be receiving a request for support from Costa Rica and Senegal as well. By mid of this year, we're looking at request for support from Malawi, the Gambia, Rwanda, Bangladesh as well, and of course, the Pacific. So there's a lot of momentum in terms of the work which we have done. And so the submission of the request for support by these countries is obviously an important step. So which means at the political level, countries have communicated what are their priorities through the RFS. And the process that kicks in once the submission is received, as I mentioned earlier, the quality assurance, the technical advisory group, it needs to do its work, in terms of solutions checking, the relevance, and, data modeling and all this stuff that needs to be checked. I mean, whilst it's going to take some time, I don't expect that this is going to be a long sort of winded exercise. There's a lot of efficiency in the process because ultimately we need to be very, very responsive to the countries, right? Climate disasters are not waiting. It can strike anytime. So I think the onus is on us to sort of really streamline the process and ensure that, we go back to the countries to say, okay, you submitted 10 requests, in your RFS. We're able to, support maybe 3 at this point in time based on what's relevant and based on the funding which is available. So there's a lot of work which is happening in terms of taking forward the request for support and really shifting the dial on implementation. This is the sort of work we expect to do for the large part in 2025. One more thing I'd like to add here is that Global Shield is really working on pre-arranged financing. And of course, there are other sort of, there's a multilateral fund which is now set up, which is a fund for responding to loss and damage. And we know that there is a nimble program run by the CVF and the V20, which is a V20's loss and damage funding program. And I think multilateral banks are also sort of working on CAT bonds and, shock resilient loans and all this stuff, right? So what we need to be able to do, and this is really one of the objectives for Global Shield, in the course of this year, is that we really need to sort of position ourselves and really on the basis of what we do, how we do what we do, and the in-country process work of the Global Shield, we need to be able to sort of bring all this to the fore and project and position Global Shield in a way that is useful in the loss and damage financing architecture. And I think my colleagues and I, we've been discussing, quite a lot in terms of the value add for Global Shield, especially when it comes to looking at the financing modalities and access modalities of the FRLD. We do believe that the in-country process of the Global Shield is a very useful model, something which is, country-led, inclusive, something that the FRLD certainly can benefit out of. And so we are definitely, projecting ourselves, in that space, and we are definitely going to get into much deeper conversations, with FRLD in terms of how they can, of our country-led model, and in doing so, how we can, sort of advance, both our mandate and FRLD gets to advance, their mandate as well. But looking at the sort of, risk landscape, because most of the climate risks can be modeled, I think there's huge opportunity for pre-arranged, finance, and we need to, sort of look at all sorts of, the suite of, pre-arranged financing solutions that can be deployed in, in countries, in climate vulnerable countries.
Fantastic. So I think we'll be following closely to see how these new countries fare in terms of their request for support and then into implementation. Now, Nilesh, if there are those listening to the podcast and want to see how they can get involved with the Global Shield, or particularly at the country level, what opportunities are there for local stakeholders and players to participate in these in-country processes and then in the implementation itself?
Okay, first things first, there's a lot of information, lots of in-country work, that we are doing, blogs that we are writing. All this is available on globalshield.org. Do also follow us on LinkedIn and X as well. With respect to the in-country work, Jack, this is something, as I mentioned, we do work with, one focal agency of government across all Global Shield countries, and this is, in most cases, this is the Ministry of Finance. So all that engagement that needs to happen at the country level, for example, if there is civil society organizations who are interested and want to contribute in the process, this will need to be under the auspices of the Ministry of Finance, because they are the conveners, they are a go-to government agency. So anytime, when we convene these country dialogues, the Ministries of Finance or whichever agency of government is the focal agency, they will extend invitation to all these agencies. And I have witnessed this in my last country mission, which was in Bangladesh. We had huge support from civil society organization, people who are working in their own sort of individual spaces. They have their own pockets of funding. They're doing their own sort of individual financial solutions. It was very interesting to see how a government was able to sort of mobilize all these stakeholders, and I think there's a huge opportunity for us to sort of build on those conversations and really look at some of the financial solutions that will eventually work for people and livelihoods.
Fantastic. Well, Nilesh, thanks so much for your time and joining me on the show. It's been really, really fascinating to learn more about climate disaster finance and the work of the Global Shield.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jack.
This was Series 1, Episode 6 of the Financial Inclusion Unlocked podcast. Check out all of the other episodes in this series as we talk all things financial inclusion. If you do have any feedback about the show, find me on LinkedIn at Jack Farron or drop me a line on jack@sijmedia.com. Thanks to SCBF for supporting our first series. You can learn about how they are innovating inclusive finance and how you or your organisation can support their work. Thanks to the SCBF for supporting our first series. You can learn more about how they are innovating inclusive finance and how you or your organisation can support their work to fund more transformative projects by visiting www.scbf.ch.